Phenomena. Phenomena. Phenomena.
The Muppets is a franchise very near and dear to my heart. I have fond memories from growing up of Muppets from Space being one of my favorite films of all time, right after Great Mouse Detective. Many of the more adult jokes may have gone over my head when I was a kid, but I didn't care. There were singing frogs and joking bears, Swedish chefs and boomerang fish. They made me realize just how creative the world can be if such weird, wacky humor can come from just a few puppets. I've idolized Jim Henson for many, many years, and have made it a point to see everything that he had his hands on. All the Muppet films and the Muppet Show, Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, Emmett Otter and Fraggle Rock. All of these, in one way or another, have shaped who I am, and I wouldn't want it any other way. I personally like to think that Brian Henson is somewhat similar, idolizing his father to the point of taking over the company that Jim had started from the ground up so many years ago. Brian spent a lot of time when he was younger inside the Muppet Workshop, even performing a few key characters within the Muppet roster over the years, as well as voicing Hoggle in Labyrinth. He's directed 2 mainline Muppets films, and has helped to keep Jim Henson's dream alive, with various groups dedicated to the art of puppetry, including an adult-oriented improv and puppet show called Puppet Up. Brian Henson clearly has had his father on his mind since his unfortunate passing, as many of the projects he's done over the years reflect Jim Henson himself. So when I first saw the trailers for the Happytime Murders, I knew that some part of Brian was trying to live out a dream his father couldn't achieve in his lifetime. Jim Henson was always filled with ideas about being more than just a children's entertainer or a children's puppeteer. The Muppet Show featured more adult-oriented humor that could also appeal to kids. Labyrinth and Dark Crystal were much darker than the usual Muppet fare, with great shadows, dark themes, and, suggestive humor. Even some of his non-Muppet work, like a short film called Timepiece, had less optimistic takes on life, but all clearly have that indistinguishable Henson charm and passion to them. To me, the Happytime Murders is a love letter of sorts, from Brian Henson to his dad. A way for Brian Henson to try and live out a dream his father had always had. Make an adult puppet show. Had Avenue Q not come out several years prior, I would have said that they mostly succeeded. That said, the film could have really used some work before it hit cameras. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. The film itself is alright. It's not bad, but also not great, and a lot of the reviews I have seen of the film are a bit harsher on it than I think they really need to be. A lot of the jokes might not land, but the technical merits of the film are astounding to say the least. But let's look at some of the more glaring problems the film has, so that if Brian Henson and Henson Alternative want to try and a venture like this again in the future, maybe they'll have a few notes to work off of.
X gon' give it to you. Fuck, wait for you to get it on your own. X gon' deliver.
Let's start with the plot, which, if you need a refresher, it basically boils down to the former members of a primetime show being killed off as they are set to inherit equal shares of a royalty sum when their old show is set to come up for syndication. We see pretty much all of them die at some point. Our lead is blamed for a good portion of the film. Melissa McCarthy has a felt liver. We get a Basic Instinct scene that was done way better in Deadpool 2, but is way more integral to the plot of this film. And we learn that the real killer all along was a puppet named Sandra White, who was actually the daughter of a man that Phil Phillips, our lead, accidentally killed when he missed a shot on someone holding a gun to Melissa McCarthy's head. Now that's horribly simplified, but let me ask you something very important about it. Does it sound like one of the main themes of a plot like that should include tacked-on racism? Because that's what we get! From the very start of the film, we're given a narrative that says that puppets are less than humans, And this wouldn't really be a problem for me usually, but this film wastes that narrative on making it more of a justification for cheap jokes, rather than having it be a well thought out or poignant satire. To help clarify my point, I want to take a brief look at two other films that have the same type of narrative. David Ayer's Netflix exclusive Bright, and Robert Zemeckis' Who Framed Roger Rabbit. In Bright, the orcs are looked down upon because they sided with the Dark Lord 2,000 years ago. Bright uses its racial differences as a crutch to justify some plot points, but leaves more questions about the world that never really get answered. Like, why are people still mad at the orcs after thousands of years? How did events like the Alamo still happen in this revisionist history? How does Shrek happen in this world? Why are the orcs the main target of racism when it was actually an orc who helped bring peace as well? And probably most importantly, why do people keep letting David Ayer direct films when they have no writer? Bright is very much a film that could have been improved upon, but many of the choices made in the film are laughable at best,
Fairy lives don't matter today.
and straight up harmful at worst.
Fairy lives don't matter today.
Much of the film pushes buttons on a machine that ultimately does nothing, and brings up topics of race, segregation, racism, workplace harassment, and gang violence, but doesn't do much with them outside of the most basic, cliche, narrative tropes when they even get that far. The world is not built well, with the fantasy elements of orcs, elves, magic, centaurs, and more slapped into a modern-day Los Angeles, and the film doesn't even use this to its advantage. Contrast this with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which I will openly admit right now is one of my favorite films of all time, and I might be a little biased towards. In Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the lines between human and toon are clearly drawn. Toons are separate because they are toons. They are destructive. They don't adhere to the normal standards of morality or even physics that we do, and they can be a bit of a general nuisance. This even goes so far as to having the toons live in their own town, separated from the rest of the Hollywood area and only accessible via a tunnel. Toons in this world are a form of entertainment, but they don't mind that. To them, it's them doing their job. Most of the populace even adores toons, with their only real frame of reference in terms of racism towards them coming from Eddie Valiant, our main lead, and Judge Doom, the antagonist and evil toon who killed Eddie's brother. In this case, the inherent racism is justified in both characters. Valiant has a vendetta against toons because one killed his brother, and Judge Doom is more looking for a profit, and the destruction of his own kind can lead him to financial superiority, leading to a little bit of a anti-toon nature to him. This makes a narrative about racism have context, and that's something that the Happytime Murders severely lacks. We don't know why people hate these puppets. They just do. There was no war 2,000 years ago where the puppets sided with the Dark Puppet Lord, and the lead character doesn't have some sort of vendetta against humans or puppets because the other murdered a family member. Racism itself does not have a purpose. But fantasy racism, when used for narrative purposes, no matter how covered in cloth it might be, should still serve a narrative purpose. It's racism for the sake of racism. And in this context, that also means it's just there for the sake of a few jokes. Unlike Who Framed Roger Rabbit and the version of Bright we got, we could remove the racism narrative from Happytime Murders, and nothing would change. There's no reason for them to hate the puppets. And I feel like it takes more away from a potential story than it adds to it. Removing the racism angle embedded in the story would allow them more time to flesh out the humor a bit better and improve upon the mystery the film ultimately tells. Speaking of that,
Knock, knock, open up the door, it's real. With the non-stop pop out from stainless steel.
The Happytime Murders is a crime drama through and through, with the standard tropes of having to solve a murder mystery as more bodies pile up, a grizzled former detective turned private eye, and a seedy underworld that said detective just so happens to have a few contacts in. Like any good crime drama, we get a clear setup, establish the key characters and potential victims should they be relevant to the plot, and from there, we get to see the carnage unfold. Throw in a few jokes here and there to have, make it a comedy, and you should have a masterpiece, right? Well, the problem with this film is in the mystery of who is committing these murders. Sandra White, the main villain of the film, isn't well established as a villain until we get the flashback sequence, where we see Phil miss his shot, which inadvertently kills an innocent man, and Edwards gets injured. From there, it's almost blatantly obvious who the villain is, but thanks to a very specific visual clue, it's all but hammered into the viewer's head that Sandra White is the killer. She wants revenge on Phil for killing her dad by mistake, and apparently that means killing the Happytime Gang, a group that he wasn't even directly involved with. The closest connection was his brother being a member of the cast, and I won't lie, his death was actually kind of funny. She does give sort of a motive along the lines of wanting to see Phil suffer, but it ultimately falls flat when you realize just how unconnected that train of thought really is. Phil isn't really connected with most of the cast outside of his brother and Jenny, his ex-lover. Speaking of Jenny, her involvement in the overall plot is even more confusing, since it's apparently a twist when she shows up at the end alive and well, despite being burned alive in her car. Jenny's involvement in the plot goes from target to victim in basically the same scene. She then shows up at the very end of the film with no explanation about how she survived. It's revealed that Sandra used her as a way of getting to that sweet, sweet syndication money. The problem with this is that, once again, it's completely unneeded. Having her as a victim makes sense for the overall plan of killing the Happytime Gang, but it would have been much better if that didn't happen, or if we were given a reveal of how she actually survived the car fire. But instead, we're given a surprise reveal at the end of the film that doesn't contribute anything to it. This is just yet another aspect of the film that could have been written out easily, removed entirely, and you might be noticing a pattern with all the problems I have with it. So that begs the question, what should we leave in?
Go hard getting busy with it, but I got such a good heart that I make the motherfucker wonder.
The film itself does have a fun premise of puppets from an old TV show being murdered, as fun as that sounds, but doesn't do much with it. Each of the members of the Happytime Gang are being killed just as their old show is about to hit syndication, and with each dead cast member comes the potential of them getting more money. This is a clearly established point in the plot, and it's not used well. As it stands, the film offers plenty of potential red herrings. Each of the cast members of the initial show can be involved, as could their producer. That gives the potential of at least 8 different characters established from the original Happytime Gang production that could be murderers looking for a bigger cut. Instead, we're given a narrative where someone else was slighted by someone else not involved with the gang directly, using that person and then trying to frame them. I feel that the narrative could have done completely without Sandra White. Aside from 1 or 2 jokes and the twist that she's the villain at the end, she doesn't offer much to the overall plot. Her entire existence in this film is as a sex symbol, which makes sense for a noir-style film, but not this one, and they take every opportunity they can just to bash that fact into your head that she is a sex symbol. If anything, Jenny should have been the villain of this film all along and on her own. If Jenny were the ultimate bad guy in the film, it would work better with just about every aspect of the film. It would work better with the anti-puppet nature the film is trying to promote. She might be the only human cast member on the Happytime Gang, but that also means she's pushed aside for the puppets, for fan appreciation and merchandise, and that builds resentment, potentially years of it. When we see her in the film, she's working in a strip club just to get by. And since they are clearly shown to have enjoyed a high life thanks to the success of the show that eventually dwindled down, it would have been easy to combine this with a narrative about how all the cast members hated one another behind closed doors. This would not only feed into a more interesting narrative related to the inciting action, but would allow all the disparate elements of the film's current state to have more context. The anti-puppet mentality could be touched on a bit further, making it less of a shoehorned-in idea and let it be more relevant to the plot. The scene where Jenny burns in the car fire, it could have been played off as a way of her pushing aside suspicion towards herself, maybe at a crucial point in the film where some evidence is pointing directly at her. It could even give them a playground of options for red herrings and backstory for the separate characters of the Happytime gang, giving them a chance to keep the audience guessing until the final moments of the film. If they really wanted to use Sandra, she could have been more of a minion to Jenny, sent to distract Phil rather than be the one to orchestrate the whole plan, ultimately flipping the roles the two villainous women have in the final version we get. Not going to touch on the fact that the two main female leads outside of Melissa McCarthy happen to be bad. That's a whole different can of worms. Even just a little change to the story like this could have made this film great. Well, almost.
You did it, damn right, and I'll do it again. 'Cause I am life, so I got to win.
The one thing I haven't really touched on much with this film so far is the variety of jokes present. Most of the moment-to-moment humor is done with some cheap jokes related to a variety of adult ventures, which me even mentioning that means I'll probably get my video taken down for inappropriate content, but it's the Happytime Murders, I was expecting that anyway. Many of the jokes are quick, easy, and cheap gags that don't warrant more than a chuckle. There were a few moments in there that got me to genuinely laugh out loud, but for the most part, it was humor that they either showed in the trailers or were duds that fell flat. They relied so much on this cheap, quick humor that the good jokes really stood out, but they were few and far between, making the relatively short runtime of an hour and 30 minutes feel that much longer. If they were to try again, I would say the humor is the one thing to be touched up the most. Making some of the humor more satirical, relying less on just shooting insults in every other scene, and avoiding the less common denominator would be the route to go. Making it more like Avenue Q and less like Family Guy, in other words. Thought out comedy that touches on sensitive subjects in a more light-hearted manner. If the film had even a few more visual gags, I think it would have been a bit more fun. As it stands, much of the visual splendor of the film is taken up with a few everyday scenes, like a weightlifter on the beach or a puppet walking along a side street. For someone like me who likes to see this stuff in action behind the scenes and stuff, it's awesome. But to an average viewer, I think it just boils down to more one of those moments of, huh, neat. A little update to the visual gags, and a big update to the verbal jokes, wouldn't even be that hard. A simple rework of the script with one or two other writers would allow for a better tone to some of the jokes, and it would ultimately feel like they were trying to put extra effort into making the jokes not only funny, but worthy of more than just a chuckle. Humor is one of the cornerstones of this kind of film, and when it's not there, it hurts it. To once again pull from the Netflix properties, BoJack Horseman plays with this concept fantastically. Even small characters in the background can be used for a visual joke of sorts, like when a jogging rooster shouts that it's morning instead of cawing. It's played for a laugh while the plot unfolds around that. Even the premise of both properties work well together, with both focusing on the lives of stars after their hit shows went under and they were left on their own. Existential humor is the new thing, baby, and seeing existential puppets would have been hilarious. But that's not what we got. What we got instead was a plot too focused on a pointless racism narrative to provide any worthwhile humor, with a mystery that ultimately doesn't make sense, all for the sake of a few new puppet tricks that are overshadowed by lazy writing. It's frustrating to see how this product could have been made better with just a few simple changes. It could have been great! But that's not what we got.
Break bread with the enemy. No matter how many cats I break bread with, I'll break.
The Happytime Murders feels like it wants to be Avenue Q, but ends up just being another raunchy, needlessly over-the-top crime drama comedy whatever that just so happens to feature puppets this time. If the film's overall story had some more weight to it, or tried to comment on an aspect of society rather than just introduced elements for the sake of making a joke, I feel it would have been a much better product. As it stands, the film is still kind of fun to watch, and while it has its flaws, I still kind of say it's worth watching. The technical merits behind the film make it worth seeing alone, in my opinion, as you get to see full-body puppets walking around as if they don't have someone's hand shoved into them and to make them move. The overall premise is fun, if a little racy at times, and if nothing else, it could be a fun film to see with a few friends or while drunk. 5 out of 10. Not bad, not great, but still okay enough to watch. If you love the Muppets but want a more adult edge to it, I'd say check it out. Just proceed with caution.